information about you. I have. So my other screen's not working. So thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm hoping we'll get joined by more people. Holly very kindly agreed to present to us today on her paper. And Holly is a South African. I don't know if anyone else can admit people while I'm looking here. Thank you, Carl. So she got a PhD from UKZN, and she was awarded an NRF Scarce Skills Scholarship from 2014 to 17. 3 years, during her 3 years, she identified key data gaps in the field of environmental microplastic contamination, both nationally and internationally, specifically investigating the distribution of particles across marine and freshwater compartments. In mid-2018, after a short period working for it's called the African Marine Waste Network, which is something I've not heard of, Holly was hired as a postdoc fellow at the University of Birmingham, where she currently leads the Leverhulme funded 100 Plastic Rivers project with Professor Stephen Krauser, whose name I do know for some reason. So the project investigates the distribution of microplastics in rivers globally, in particular how their physical and chemical properties differ and how plastic particles may propagate through freshwater food webs. She also studies mechanical transport and accumulation patterns of microplastic fragments and fibers under variable hydrodynamic and sediment conditions using artificial flumes. Such a rapidly evolving field of science, she spends a lot of her time working across disciplines to co-develop and improve analytical techniques used in microplastic detection, and in particular interested in developing low-cost screening tools for microplastic monitoring. So that is what I obtained from Holly. I would hope, Holly, that you will tell us a little bit more about yourself. We've learned already that you live in the UK and you are living there for now, and we are hoping that you're going to come back at some point. But anyway, please, the floor is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Sorry if there's any noise. I'm actually, like I said, I'm in a storeroom because we have limited space on where we are allowed to do meetings, and I seem to be nicely positioned right next to the toilet. So if there's any flushing, then that will be explained. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully I will be able to do this properly. I've got lots of presentations open.
Yes.
Okay, so I can't see anyone. I can just see my screen. So if you do,
that's all good. That's all good.
Okay, good. Give me a shout if there's any problems. So I'm Holly Nel. I'm South African. I did my PhD at the University of KZN, and I did a postdoc at Rhodes University with obviously National Research Foundation money, and then I and my partner relocated very temporarily. So yes, we do plan to come back to South Africa, for those who are wondering. But we did want to gain some international experience. So we were very lucky to both find work. And I got a research fellowship position at the University of Birmingham, where I am now, looking at microplastics in the freshwater environment. So slightly different to the marine environment, but it's been a great learning curve, applying the knowledge that I learned at Rhodes for microplastics in the marine environment and looking at it in the freshwater environment. So I'm going to talk about a paper that we recently published. I think it was in January this year, with some colleagues from South Africa, Trisha Naidu, also UKZN, Emmanuel, who's in Nigeria, Tamuka, who is at the University of Zimbabwe, and Fedara, who did his PhD in China but is from Nigeria, and then Stefan Kraus, who, like I said, is my line manager and supervisor here at the University of Birmingham. And the paper was published in Environmental Research Letters, and it's entitled, you can see here, Collaboration and Infrastructure Are Needed to Develop an African Perspective on Microplastics, Microplastic Pollution. So I'm not I'm going to start with more broad issues of plastic and microplastics, and I'm sure you're all well aware of these issues, but because I don't know the audience and everything like that, I just thought I would give a general introduction before I start going into a bit more details about what the paper is about. But we know, I mean, we all know that plastic pollution is a problem, and we've all seen it. We all experience it on a day-to-day basis. It's not an African problem. It's not a British problem. It's a global problem. This problem changes. It's very dynamic. You can have beaches that look extremely clean, and then the Amgeni River comes down after a flood, and suddenly you see images like this, which are hugely worrying, and things like that. But what I really work on is how these plastics break down and move through the system. So this is just another image that I wanted to put in, because I think the conversations that I have definitely noticed as I've come to the UK is a lot of mismatch between whose problem is this. We know that Africa does have a problem with plastic pollution like the rest of the world. There was a paper published by Jenna Jambek in 2015, and again another paper in 2018 that really wanted to dive into the data on how bad is the problem in Africa, and is it going to get worse? And what they say is that there's a few select countries that have issues, and that to...
Sorry, hold just a moment. Somebody's unmuted. Can you please make sure you're all muted? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll wait a few seconds. Yes, so basically this paper looked into waste mismanagement in different countries and how it would contribute to the issue of marine litter, and the paper showed that, for example, Nigeria and Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, South Africa are likely to contribute the most to marine litter because of population growth, urbanization, and the change to a more plastic-dominated consumer market. But there's also other areas that are going to have huge increases in the future. So plastic isn't going to go away. We know that it degrades very slowly in the environment and in certain environments. And we really need to understand not only solutions, but also know that this is a legacy problem. It's not going to go away. So we need to understand how it's going to affect our ecosystems. And the other major concern really is you find these headlines about flooding Africa with plastics. You know, these conversations need to be had on how that's going to affect the ecosystem in the long run. So as I mentioned, I mainly work on microplastics. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the audience here, but micro is small plastic particles. There's debate on what sizes these are and where they come from. And this is just an image I took in Kalk Bay, and you can understand how microplastics degrade where they washed up on beaches, they're exposed to wave action, sun, and they slowly degrade into these smaller and smaller fragments. And these fragments can then be taken up by various organisms, or now they're finding that they actually alter how soils interact and therefore hold moisture and nutrients, and that can have effects on our crop development and things like that. So there's a huge amount of problems that come with these particles. And then you also get particles that are manufactured for those sizes. So you get the larger ones, such as these pellets that get turned into plastic bottles, but you also find microbeads and scrubs and things like that. In the UK, they now banned these beads going down the manufacture of them, so they're not going down into the wastewater treatment facilities and then into the rivers, but they are still around, and they're not a huge component of the microplastic mixture that you find in the environment, but it is an easier fix. We know where they are and we know how they get into the environment, so it's quite an easy solution. Where the other microplastics, it's a little more difficult. Another example of microplastics, which is quite a headliner and quite a dominant plastic particle that you find in the environment, are these fibers. Your clothes that you're wearing, the carpets, the curtains, all of these shed plastic fibers as they get older and as they get washed and used. And these fibers go down into the wastewater treatment plants. They get taken up into the atmosphere. You're inhaling them. They fall on your food. They're everywhere. They're a nightmare because actually we have to control for them in our labs because they can contaminate our samples, and then we don't actually know if the signal is from the sediment or environmental sample we've taken, or if it's actually just contamination from the lab. So plastics are everywhere, and we need to understand how they affect us and the ecosystem, because, like I said, they are legacy pollutants. So what I do is I mainly look at sources and sinks and how particles get from one point to the other, so how they behave in the aquatic environment. And this is just an example of an obvious source and how we track the sinks. So it's a nice way of seeing how we saw a spill. We know where the source is. We know what the contaminant was. I think it was polyethylene pellets. And then the scientists that were working on this were able to track how it moved through the marine environment. So it was quite a nice tracer experiment, not nice for the environment and a huge problem, but it did give a lot of scientists something to talk about on sources and sinks and distributions of this particular pollutant. But what we usually get are, this is a project that we have in India, so we're studying the microplastic contamination in sediments and waters along the entire 2,500 kilometer stretch of the Ganges Delta, and we're looking at sediment and water, and there's no obvious source. Your sources can be your effluents, your sources can be your washing clothes, tourism, industry, your sources can be agriculture, with plastics being spread and sludge being spread over agriculture. So we now have to untangle this data and try identify where these plastics are potentially coming from and where they're ending up. And it's very important to understand where they're ending up, because that's where our vulnerable ecosystems will be. Those are the ecosystems that will potentially take these pollutants up at the end of the day. So what we do, for those of you who are new to the microplastic sides, but we take a sediment sample and we use a density separation technique where we actually float the plastics out of the matrix that it's in, whether it's sewage sludge or river sediment or beach sand, and we extract these, and a lot of other things come up with it. So you're extracting your organics as well, which can make it difficult to identify what's a plastic and what's not a plastic. And so what we do is we digest these organics as best as possible. It's not always easy to get rid of everything, and try get as clean a sample as possible that just has the plastics left behind. And then we use a stain. Not all researchers in this field use stains, but some do and some don't. But we use a Nile red stain, which actually adheres to the plastic particle and makes it fluoresce at a higher intensity than all the background noise. So it makes it really much easier to identify than if you're going through the sample and just trying to see what's a plastic and what's not a plastic. So we then look at the morphological characteristics, we look at the sizes, we look at the area of the particle, and all of this information will help us understand how these particles move through the system. For example, if you find lots of fibers, we know that fibers stay in the water column for a lot longer and therefore can be distributed a lot further. And those fibers are also, in most cases, associated with a certain type of source. Like I said, your clothing, your effluence, your urbanization sides of things. But then we also get fragments, and fragments are often associated with, for example, the breakage of larger plastics. So that could be, they would have to be in the water column for a lot longer. So all of this information gives us some idea of potentially where they come from, what journey they took to get to where we found them, and potentially how dangerous or toxic they're going to be to the environment that they are in at that time. And one of the key things that we do afterwards is we actually analyze these microplastics for the chemistry. So we look at whether it's a polyethylene fragment or polypropylene or PET, and all of this information gives us another gauge through the looking glass of where these potentially could come from and how toxic they can be. For example, polyethylene and polypropylene are very dominant in the packaging industry, where maybe PMMA and those things are less often found but could be more toxic. So these are kind of questions that we ask ourselves quite often. And then,
Holly,
yes?
Can I just interrupt you? Are you happy to take some questions as you go along?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I can't see the questions, so okay. I can just see my screen.
Okay, thank you. I actually do have a question, if I may, but I think you kind of just answered it, which is the word plastic a thing? You've just mentioned two different kinds, polypropylene and polyethylenes, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if polystyrene fits into that picture. But the question really is, when you say plastic, you don't really mean one thing. You mean a whole range of things. It's a category of chemicals, right?
That's a very good question. And if there's other questions that I can't see, just interrupt me. But there's actually recently a paper that came out. It's called, gosh, what is it? Like Contamination as a Suite of Plastics or Diversity. It basically is a paper entirely on that topic. The plastics that we find in the environment they're different shapes, they're different sizes, they're different colors, they're coated with biofilm, without biofilm. They have different additives, different fillers. It's just enormous amounts of species in a way. So we are starting to look at them as species and things like that, because like I said, fibers are going to behave very differently in the environment than maybe very heavy PVC fragments that will settle out straight by where the source is. And it also means that organisms are going to take them up completely different. Fibers are often found in the guts of species. But whether that is because they get retained, because they often form these clusters and then they get stuck in the gut, so their gut retention is a lot longer than spheres that would just pass through. So they behave very differently, and then their toxicity will be very different. So it is a huge problem when trying to identify them, because like you said, they're just everything is different. So yeah, it's a good question. So on that, for example, we do these analysis pipelines, and this we hope to help make it clear in the papers that we're publishing what types of plastics we are able to detect with the techniques that we use. So like you said, are we better at detecting polyethylene and polypropylene in the environment, or is our technique better for fibers, or is it better for fragments? And different labs have different capabilities, and these are conversations that the community is having in light of the fact that we know how diverse this pollutant is. So we often give these kind of like lab-based pipelines along in our papers, and they change for every study that we do, because every study has different challenges. That sewage sludge has a huge amounts of organics that you need to get rid of. River environments have different types of twigs and stones and things that may interfere with how you quantify plastics, and sometimes you need to do 2 digestions, sometimes you need to do 1, sometimes staining doesn't work. So it's always evolving, and every project is different. So we set up these pipelines. So I just thought I'd give you an idea. But at the end of these pipelines always comes chemical characterization, and that's what this paper this is what we talk about in the paper. Just before I go on to that, this is the project that I was talking about in India, and this is why we need polymer identification and why it helps. So polymer identification is good as a verification tool. So if you say this is a plastic, or this is, I mean, that's all you can say, this is a plastic, polymer identification will be able to tell you this is actually a polypropylene fragment. And like I said, that gives you a lot more information, and helps with targeted mitigation strategies, helps with monitoring, helps with interpret the data as a whole. So this is the project that we did in India, looking at the distribution of plastics along the Ganges Delta, and you can see already we've got so much information by looking at the polymer identity. Polypropylene and sometimes polyethylene and polyurethane are the 3 most dominant types of polymers in this environment. And why is that? Where is it coming from? How can we use this information to find solutions specific for this delta? So I'm going to go to the paper now. There's a huge data gap in Africa when it comes to plastic, microplastic pollution. And when we started looking into the studies, we wanted to see if there were kind of data hubs or geographical hubs that are really pumping out the microplastic publications. And if you look into the publications, where they're coming from, most of them are coming from China, the US, Germany, England, Italy. And then if you start looking into African countries, all of the African countries combined only contribute 3% of the published literature on microplastics specifically. We didn't look at larger plastics. And when you look at this 3%, most of it's coming out of South Africa, Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Kenya, for example. But I mean, some people can argue, well, if we know how plastics behave in the Ganges, won't it behave the same in Africa and systems there? So really, do we need to get more data on where the particles are and how they behave, and should we not be focusing on solutions? And although we should be focusing on solutions, we really don't know enough about microplastics in Africa. For example, there's going to be different sources, 2 sources on the top of well, what we were discussing, we do discuss in the paper, is, for example, the burning of plastics will be a source for microplastics. They don't get rid of the plastics. Larger plastics, it actually just creates a lot of small plastics. You've also got a lot of these e-waste centers that not only are going to be plastic pollution, but there's going to be a lot of other harmful flame retardants associated with them. So it's going to be a more complex type of plastic that's actually polluting the environment. Your concentrations may be different, and things like that. And also, it's not just the plastic that we should be worried about. It's really what additives there are and what surface structures there could be. There's been a couple of papers that have shown that they have a unique biota or bacteria sphere around them that can transport harmful microbes. They aggregate differently in different climates. They behave very different in different climates, and the fact that we have this African blind spot means that we actually don't understand how the ecosystem will be affected by these pollutants in the long run. And like I said, the exposure and the ecological toxicity. So it's really important to get this data. But one of the major hindrances and limitations that researchers in Africa face is this step, which is polymer identification. So identifying the chemical that is most polluting your system is extremely difficult. Even in here at the University of Birmingham, we struggle. But when I was in South Africa, it was so much so that a lot of the time you're publishing data that hasn't been identified chemically. And this, like I said, maybe it's a fragment or a fiber, but you won't know what polymer it is. You won't know how to assign a mitigation strategy to that, or look at polymer and look at policy interference. So on the left-hand side, this analysis pipeline just shows you how the smaller the particle is, the more expensive, the less accessible, the more time-consuming. All of these things start playing into how you can identify. And I think what initiated this paper was when I moved to the UK, I was invited to go to a number of meetings where we discussed harmonization and standardization, and I found it was coming from countries that had these fancy focal plane FTIRs and confocal Ramans, and had all of this fancy equipment, technicians dedicated to this equipment. Most of them are manufactured in Germany and the UK. So if something goes wrong, they just call up the engineer, and the engineer comes the next day and fixes it. And they're now dictating how we are going to publish papers, how we're going to standardize techniques, and how we're going to monitor. And although I think polymer identification is an extremely important step, we need to have conversations to make sure that everyone is included in that conversation. So we looked at what people were doing and how they were getting around this issue of polymer identification. And what we found was many African-led projects were collaborating with partners in overseas who had access to this infrastructure for polymer identification. We found potentially they were sending samples to commercial labs, which obviously costs a bit more money for this polymer identification. We found a number of researchers who would then go on these exchange programs, for example, DARD and the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and they would go and do their polymer identification, for example, in Germany or the UK, and then they'd come back to Africa and write up the paper. And these three examples, when we were discussing this paper with the co-authors, really struck us as kind of continually putting us in this loop of being dependent on more developed labs. So we would come back to our labs in Africa, but we would not be able to transfer that knowledge and those skills onto our students. We wouldn't have the equipment anyway to carry on researching. We'd have to go back to Germany to redo this. And it really is quite a loop of dependency on these labs. And we know from looking at other papers that this isn't specific to microplastics. This is a problem in a lot of areas. One other example we found, which we'd flag, which is really important, is CFAS, which is the fisheries department in the UK, actually had a project called Commonwealth Litter Program, where they came to South Africa and they set up labs. So they bought infrastructure, they trained, they gave access to standard operating procedures. And this was really useful because it allowed a lot of people to come to these facilities and take that knowledge away to their students and not have to cross the globe to actually gain skills. And then it increases the longevity of this whole knowledge exchange work. So the paper goes on to talk about solutions that we hope will spark some sort of discussion amongst microplastic researchers, but also funders and heads of universities and things like that. was really was African researchers working on microplastics weren't collaborating outside of their country, and they were more likely to collaborate with someone in Germany and the UK as opposed to someone in a neighboring African country. And we think that to get an African perspective on microplastics, especially when rivers are crossing borders, we really need to collaborate more with each other. So what we've done is actually created this Pan-African microplastic network, where that's one of the main aims, is to get people talking and networking. And the other thing is that we really think we need to have a database that says what equipment is available in Africa for microplastic identification. Are there ways we can have sharing schemes? Who's the experts? Can we pool our resources? Can we create collaborative centers where students can come to that region and look into their samples and not have to cross over and go to the UK every time they want to look into microplastics? So yeah, I'll end there and just open it up to discussion, because I think these are just one or two solutions, but we definitely haven't thought of them all. And I think that there's a lot of other solutions that are out there that we can maybe learn from other fields. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Holly. I've got a whole list of questions I want to ask before.
I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing.
I want to just open the floor and see if there's anyone who have questions for Holly. You can just unmute yourself and go ahead if you have a question or a comment. I see RM, who that is. Please identify yourself and then go ahead. RM, it's Ray. Go ahead, Ray. You're muted still, Ray. Carl, can we unmute Ray? Do we know how? Ray is muted.
I'll have a look.
And I can see the bottom of your beard, Ray. Ray, you are still muted and I can't hear you. So I'm going to... Okay, yeah, you go. Okay, go ahead, Ray.
Right. I just wanted to know, Holly, to what extent can we rely on information that we get from trade, import and export? Because I imagine that not all the plastic that we may be using now is produced in Africa. So as part of how you can imagine buying a chemical product, each product has to have the listings of the ingredients that are there. So part of the requirements, it could be a potential solution to say that if, for instance, the chicken that we buy from America comes in plastics, part of the requirement could be that they do mention what the plastics are made of as a way to also inform us how to deal with it. Because then if you know in dealing with this type of plastic, this is what you have to do, but you first have to know what type of plastic you're dealing with, if that makes sense. So can we have it as a form of a requirement to say that all the plastic during the import and export that we get from outside countries, as per requirement, should have a list of the composition and the ingredients in making that?
Before you answer that question, can I add to that question, please, Ray? I was going to ask you that what you are working on is in the receiving end. What Ray's talking about is the production end of this chain, right? And so the problem is really one of attribution. You're looking to see what ends up in the environment and trying to classify that and then work backwards up the chain to try and attribute it to a source, in a sense. So clearly, the impact side will have an effect on policy. And Ray's talking about the upstream policy. So I was going to ask you about how you connect these dots up the chain. I think Ray has helped me by making that point. So perhaps you can respond to that. Thanks.
No, yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a difficult one, and it's one that I think we struggle with so often working on such a small scale, because like you said, you know, why aren't we then focusing on large plastics only? Because at least then we can link the two a lot nicer. What we do, to answer Ray's question in short, we've actually had a couple of meetings with Plastics Europe, which is the same as I think Plastics SA and things like that. And we had a couple of meetings in the start of our project because they were very worried about the results that we were going to find and things like that. And a lot of the plastics actually, although they will give you the bog standard structure that it's a polyethylene, and maybe they'll give you an idea of whether there is like talc powder as a filler or something like that. A lot of the time they don't give you every single additive and monomer, and it's a bit of a trade secret. And like you said, it makes it really difficult, because if we could track all of this, we could link things a lot better, because we could then go, okay, this is really linked to this product, this exact manufacturer and things like that. And you can actually do that with microplastics. So we've just submitted, it's not published, but we've just submitted a paper that uses quite a lengthy thermal GCMS. All of them were whacked into one. You know, there was like a hyphenated system for days. And it actually can tell you the additives, and it can tell you the fillers, and it can tell you a lot more information. And the more information we have, because most of the polymer identifications just say it's polyethylene, it's polypropylene. But if we have all of those fillers and things like that, then we can link them back to the products a bit better. But at the end of the day, they hold those things quite close to their hearts, and they will give you some information, but not all of it.
Well, before I pass on to Carl, whose hand is up, I want to say that I really like Ray's idea. It's all about legislation. It's done for food contents, right? Quite precisely, because you have to know what you're eating. It's done now with MCS for fisheries. So you have to have some sort of like certification. There's no reason why it can't be legislated to the degree of information necessary, so that you can attribute although again, it's not the factory's fault, the company's fault that their plastic ended up in the ocean. That might have to do with a whole lot of other role players, namely the consumers and the municipal waste, etc., etc. But I still think it's a great idea. Can we hear Carl, please?
I think so. Hi, Holly. Thanks for the lovely talk. I really enjoyed that. I wanted to ask about the problem that the plastics create. I mean, specifically, as a chemist, plastics were a great triumph, right? They are producing polymers that don't occur in nature. And so, therefore, there are no enzymes in nature that decompose them. And that mostly means that they're non-toxic, because they will pass right through you. But the big downside of it is it's great for the product, for the usefulness of it. But once you discard it, nothing breaks it down, right? So it sits there and it breaks, and it's smaller and smaller and smaller. And now it would appear that microplastics are everywhere. I mean, we're full of them already, that would appear. But I don't think it's clear, is that a problem? I mean, it sounds like it should be a problem. But could you tell us a little bit more about what is the evidence of if it's a problem or not?
Again, before you answer, I have to add that question. I'm sorry, because I also had that on my list, and I wrote it down slightly differently, which is, are there measurable impacts, in a sense that can these plastics have actual metabolic and molecular impacts? Like we have other kinds of chemical pollutants, such as persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disrupting compounds that we see, like pharmaceuticals, medicines that get into active compounds that pass through humans into urine, into the toilet, into the ocean, and they are actual like antidepressants that make fish less depressed. Excuse the joke. But my point is, to take Carl's point forward, I was going to say, are they maybe neutral because they are just plastic or not? That's the question I wanted to add. Thank you.
No, it's again a really great question, and it's something that I think microplastic researchers dedicate their entire career to just answering that question, and there's a lot of debate on that. I think I would try and split it into two. So there is a lot of information that shows that plastics are being taken up by organisms, and they are trying to link this up to what we see in the labs, and we do see issues. We do see that at certain levels they're going to have effects on mortality and growth and reproduction and things like that. A lot of the argument is then that, okay, but these are at levels that are a lot higher than what we're finding in the environment. And then the argue back is, yes, but we know that these are legacy pollutants that aren't going to go anywhere. So actually knowing how it's going to affect us in the future is a good thing. So a lot of people are starting to look at more chronic levels to see how it affects people, organisms on a long run. And there is evidence that it is going to affect certain organisms, not all of them. I think the other thing is that we've got to think about this pollutant as not just affecting the organism that it takes up, but the ecosystem that it's actually now part of. And that's a whole different aspect that people are starting to look into. We know that it changes how soils hold moisture, how soils hold nutrients, and that's going to change how maybe our crops grow. We don't know, so we need to start looking into that. We know that plastics now have a different environment, and they can actually transport the microbes that we are worried about. Maybe we're not worried about the plastics, but we're more worried about the microbes. And in fact, we've just recently submitted a paper that looks at how plastics and humans may have an effect. We know that plastics cause inflammation in cells and cell tissue, and we know that these inflammatory responses can trigger autoimmune diseases and things like that. And there's a whole nother health and plastics link that is only just starting to look at. So I think that we only know the tip of the iceberg, and that it really is going to be a problem. We're still trying to figure it out.
Thanks. The floor is open to anyone else who has comments or questions. And while we wait for you to go ahead, I see somebody. Who is that? That is, can't tell who it is. It's just a blue dot. So will blue dot please go ahead with your hand up. Shadrach, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I just have a quick question. So I'm from the nanoparticle research, and you raised a very important point, which I found very interesting in terms of Africa only accounting for the 3% of the data that's currently available. And according to your knowledge, my question then becomes, are we only studying the source and the presence in the environment, or are we also looking at associated surface contamination, as well as how long they degrade and what is then the impact throughout their life cycle?
Yeah, I think I got your question. You might have broken up at the end, but I think I got your question about what kind of papers are we publishing in Africa when it comes to micro and nano. And actually, I don't, and I stand corrected here, but I don't think we've actually published anything on nano, but that's also because, as you know, it's extremely difficult to detect in the environment. And I think they're only starting to find some proof of principle equipment now that could potentially detect nanoplastics in the environment. On a whole, I would say most of the papers are presence and distribution type papers, which with quite a few uptakes in the environment and maybe a bit of lab-based toxicity papers, which actually the lab-based toxicity papers are really good. A colleague in Nigeria was saying that it was their first go-to because you actually don't have to identify the polymer, because like you said, when you buy the polymer that you're going to expose your organism to, you know what it is. So if you don't have polymer identification capabilities, that's a good standard to start at. Looking at the surface structures and things like that, I don't think that we are looking at that too much on the micro and nano side in Africa, but I also think it's quite difficult in a whole. I don't think it's a very common topic in microplastic pollution in general. A colleague of mine actually is very interested in the microbes that are attached to the plastics, and she's spent the last 2 years trying to figure out how to do that when they get smaller and smaller. The larger they are, you can potentially do things like DNA, but the smaller it gets, it's just more difficult. So yeah, it is definitely somewhere where we need to look at, and especially, like I said, with the different climates and different environments, looking at how they break down. I think that actually microplastics may be more of a problem in warmer climates, you know, and we don't really have that data.
Thank you. Are the others? While others are thinking, I wanted to just discuss one or two other items which are very interesting. First of all, it's amazing that you're doing this and setting up this network, and I would love to be able to help you in any way that we can. And I would hope that, you know, you could, for example, have a local conference. Well, I say local, I mean a continental conference, which I can talk to you about. I think it's a really good way to cement an organization of this nature. But just getting back to this issue about the role in the ecosystem, I mean, I imagine, first of all, that macroplastics, as in bottles and buoys and packaging, gets broken down and down and down and down, and macroplastics become microplastics eventually, and fibers are fibers and become smaller fibers potentially, and that there is a physical impact, if not a chemical impact, which may or may not be a problem. You know, depending on how big or small they are. The nurdle issue is something very prominent in my life because I live 100 meters from Surface Corner in Muizenberg, and all the time there are people going nurdle hunting, especially after that incident that you spoke about in Durban Harbour, which has resulted, and I don't know if that's the only source of the nurdles or not. But nevertheless, it's interesting to know this issue. I think is really interesting is what are the effects? And as you say, I get it that we don't really know what the effects are. They certainly shouldn't be in the environment because they're not natural. So we have to assume that there's some effect, but that has to be quantified. And as you've explained already, they are either chemical or biochemical or physiological or physical, I guess, which is really, really interesting. So those are just a couple of extra comments I wanted to make. You may have a response or not.
No, I think something that you did say was, and I think it's brought back in these questions that most people have been asking is, you know, large plastics is the problem. And they break down into smaller and smaller plastics, and we're coming from it from the end, you know, and how do we link these macroplastics with micro and nano and things like that, and why? I mean, particularly in our research group here, we don't look at large plastics. We think about it and we discuss it, but we don't necessarily gather data on it. And there's some groups that don't look at microplastics, and each of them have their own effects that they would have on the environment. And I think what struck me was, you know, there's been a number of papers that have come out that solutions and monitoring is a lot easier with the larger plastics. But even if we got rid of plastics tomorrow and never used them again, the amount of plastics that are in landfills, that are in the environment, that are being circulated through waste streams, that are at the bottom of the ocean, are all breaking down. And eventually we're going to have a spike in microplastics, whether we stop plastics or not. So we need to work with these things in parallel because, like you said, they've got different effects, physical and things like that, and biological. But we need to know that there's going to be a point where microplastics is going to be very harmful, and we need to figure out what that harm is and try contain it as much as possible before those effects actually happen.
Thanks. Are there any other questions from the floor? Anybody else have a comment or a question? I think just before we finish, oh, there's one. I've got Ray, I think it is again. Go ahead, Ray.
Can you tell me, Holly, if there has been any study that you or any of your team members or any paper that you know of that goes on to check the relationship between the production of plastic and how well the habitat tends to do at country level or continental level at least? because then if we are able to check if there's any directly proportional relationship in some way, shape or form, then we would be able to come to a conclusion that shows that the more plastic that there are, these countries tend to do well, and the agricultural sector is booming, and so on and so forth. Has there been any type of feasibility study of that nature? Because then that, I think, would be a good point of departure that contributes in further discourses at policy level, at legislation level, and at science level, so that it at least gets to guide us in the direction that we ought to take.
I think I understand your question, and it's not a field that I specifically work in, but there is a field called, I think it's large systems analysis. I think it's LSA. I could be wrong. It's something along those lines, but I think it looks at what you're trying to get at is looking at plastics as a whole. Because we've got to understand that we've got to find a balance in the sense that plastics are useful. We can't just ban plastics and things like that. How is it moving through systems from start? And this goes back to the question that you had in the beginning. Where's it coming from? How much is coming from different countries? What happens when it goes through the system? Where are the leakage points? At those leakage points, is there actually a detectable problem? And if that is, what is that specific polymer that maybe is the problem where the others aren't? And it's basically this whole pipeline that links, manufacturing, production, job security, the usefulness of plastics, because we know plastics are also really useful, and things like that. And I don't know too much about it, but I think it is called large systems analysis. And it looks at the whole process, and also factors in plastics and microplastics and things like that. So it might be worth having a look into that. Yeah.
Thanks, Holly. We're going to end it soon. I wanted to tell you two things about plastics that I know. One is that I saw a presentation somewhere about global, these weren't microplastics, I don't believe. But where in the world would you guess is the worst source of plastic, or the worst incidence of plastic pollution? I don't know if you know if we're going to have the same answer.
I think the models say that it is Southeast Asia. The worst river is the Yangtze.
Actually, the worst place was it was around the Philippines. And it had to do with the fact that the squid fishery uses polystyrene as packaging. And that polystyrene ends up in the water, and it persists forever, for a very long time. So that was one interesting thing I learned. And the other is a local story. Very recently, Peter Ryan from UCT, who studies plastic pollution, among other things, and especially its impact on sea life and seabirds in particular, was wanting to do an experiment to release plastics in one of the rivers that feed into False Bay, and to monitor its destination. And there was a huge outcry against this experiment, and so it never proceeded, which is a really interesting story. So that's about that one.
I do remember that, because there's a lot of researchers in Europe, and I think the National Geographic, in fact, did a project in the Ganges at the same time that we're doing our project, where they released bottles with trackers in them, and things like that. So maybe if he had put a tracker on the polystyrene, then people wouldn't have been so upset.
All to and fro about it, but never worked out. Okay, listen, it's been a great session. Thank you very, very much for doing that. Just for the others, I've got another participant lined up for 2 weeks' time. It'll be on a Monday, the 29th, I think. But I will announce that. And Holly, it's been great to meet you and have your input. And I hope that we can hear from you in the future back home.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really great.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye. I need to see how I start.
Bye.
recording.